My name is John Lindsay Poland, and I am the Research and Advocacy Director for the Fellowship of Reconciliation. This webinar on understanding the Pentagon budget and how to move the money is the seventh in a series of webinars that we have organized in support of research skills that support activist campaigns, particularly to understand U.S. militarism. And you can find more information about Militarism Watch, including other webinars that are recorded at our webpage, which is forusa.org/militarism-watch. We'll be sending you out links to this after the webinar. A little bit of housekeeping. If you want to post questions or comments during Chris's presentation or during the webinar, please take a look at the questions box that's on the right side of your screen, and you can type in a question or a comment there, and we'll be taking those afterwards. We are recording this webinar, and it will be posted online afterwards. And we'll share that link with you if you want to share this with friends and other activists. We're very fortunate today to have with us Chris Hellman, who is a longtime analyst of U.S. military policy with a number of different organizations and as well as on Capitol Hill. He's the senior policy analyst of the National Priorities Project. And in advance of this, we received many different suggestions for what the webinar would cover. And we want to say that this is the beginning of a conversation. It's not the be-all. And we hope it will point you to further ways of being involved and understanding the military budget and what we can do to change it. So with that, I will turn it over to Chris, and welcome.
Thank you, John. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you everyone for joining us for this webinar. In addition to John's introduction, let me just spend a moment telling you about National Priorities Project if you don't already know us. We're a national federal budget analysis organization located in Northampton, Massachusetts. Our mission is to make the sometimes complex federal budget process and related information transparent and accessible so people can enter strongly into the discussion about federal spending priorities and influence how their tax dollars are spent. We're going to cover a lot of ground here today, and one of the things that John mentioned is that all this material is going to be posted and available, so complete with source references and other and guides to other useful pieces of material. So at the end, you'll be able to access pretty much everything that you've seen online. And of course, I encourage you to follow up with me directly and individually if you have any specific questions that we don't get to during the Q&A or come to you later on. Before we get into the specifics of the military, I want to spend a couple minutes speaking broadly about the way the federal budget works. Okay, there we go. The President's budget request that comes out each February, and we're about to get into the 2014 request, but we're still looking at the 2013, includes almost $3.7 trillion in total spending. This falls into three main pots. The easiest to understand is the small red one, the interest on the debt, which we pay to cover the costs of borrowing that has occurred in the past. The largest part of the federal budget is the mandatory portion, which accounts for about 2/3 of annual spending and includes a range of programs, primarily the major entitlement programs, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, but also some other things. Funding for mandatory programs is based on existing law, and it basically happens on a needs-based or if you meet a statutory requirement, a statutory set of conditions, you're automatically eligible for the maturity of mandatory spending. Changes in mandatory spending programs can and do occur, but they happen rather infrequently and are the results of major policy discussions. So for instance, during the coming months, you will almost certainly hear a discussion about entitlement reform, focusing primarily on Medicare, but also possibly on Social Security. But these are infrequent changes, and as I said, represent a significant shift in federal policy. The portion of the federal budget that we focus on annually is the remaining third, the discretionary portion. This is the part that the President must request each year and Congress must act to approve, and it includes a broad range of programs, but this is where this is of interest to us because A, it's the portion that Congress has to enact on an annual basis, and B, this is where Pentagon spending lives. So let's look specifically at the discretionary portion of the budget. When you look at just that 1/3 and you break it out into its component parts, you'll see that the military accounts for well over half of total discretionary spending. The remainder of the discretionary budget is broken out for a range of things, including scientific research, funding for education, foreign international affairs budget, which includes foreign assistance programs, and then some smaller things. But the part to point out is that the military represents well over half of this and has done so historically for decades, usually accounting for over 50% for most of the time, and sometimes as high as 60%. There is a process, and NPP offers a number of different analyses of how the federal budget process works. I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time focusing on that, but very briefly, as I indicated, and this is represented by the orange box to the left, the upper left, the President submits to Congress each year his request for the coming fiscal year, which begins on October 1st. By law, he is required to do so by no later than the first Monday in February. But in recent years, the Obama administration has not met that deadline, and they have already indicated that they will not hit that deadline this year. The expectation is that the budget request will be delayed by probably at least a month, but no date certain has been set. But this is where the annual appropriations and congressional review process of the discretionary budget begins with his request and moving forward from that. And one of the resources we provide is a version of this chart that shows during the process what types of discussions are going on Capitol Hill, because it's important to remember that during different times in the process you're going to want to have different conversations because you're talking about different components of the budget and how it's being acted on. The green portion all the way to the right is the part of the federal budget process that occurs before the President makes his request. It's the review of the budget by the federal agencies themselves, and where they generate their submissions for the budget moving forward. It is possible for activists to be involved in this portion, but by and large this tends to be the portion of the iceberg that you don't usually see, and it's during the congressional part, the part that's in blue, that activists have the most opportunities to have a direct impact on the annual spending decisions. One of the things that we've recently developed to help people keep track of what's going on is our new federal budget timeline. And if we have time later on, we'll do a quick tour of the NPP website, and I'll show you what this is. And what this is an interactive timeline that shows you budget milestones and also links you to additional information about what their relevance is and how they represent the process as it moves forward. This we really launched basically about three weeks ago. It's brand new, and we're looking at it as a really good way to help people steer through the process, both as it's supposed to work, but also as it's working in practice. So let's get into some of the numbers. We talked briefly about the discretionary budget before. What this table shows is the discretionary budget dating back to the 1970s. The blue line at the top represents Pentagon spending. The yellow line represents non-Pentagon discretionary spending. And we pull out the green line at the bottom, which is the international affairs budget, so that what you're looking at when you look at the blue and the yellow lines is what we refer to as the defense and the non-defense discretionary portions of the budget. And as you can see, while discretionary spending has risen over the last decade, defense spending has risen much more dramatically. And if you were to remove, for instance, the spike that represents the $780 billion of the Recovery Act enacted in 2008, you can see that defense spending is significantly higher than non-defense discretionary spending. And that over time, one of the things we hear repeatedly, for instance, is that if we didn't give so much money to foreign countries, we wouldn't have a deficit problem. But if you look at the green line, what you find is that it's a relatively insignificant number within even the discretionary budget. If you look at it within the total federal budget, it represents only about 1% of total federal spending. Meanwhile, Pentagon spending, adjusted for inflation, has risen by almost 50% over the last decade. And it's important to point out that where you see, to the far right of the screen, where you see the blue line descending, that's a reflection not of the Pentagon's budget going down, the Pentagon's annual budget going down. It's more a reflection of the fact that we're winding down the war in Afghanistan and that we've halted combat operations in Iraq. So that's really a reflection in reductions in annual war costs rather than reductions in Pentagon budget, which, as you'll see later on, is actually continues to be on an upward trend. What this table shows is how your annual tax dollar is spent, your income tax dollar is spent. This is a publication that National Priorities Project does annually, where we take your tax dollar and we break it down into its component parts, and you can see how each of your tax dollars are spent. What's important to note here is that this represents just your income tax. It doesn't recognize revenue sources from other sources like your Social Security and Medicare payroll taxes, nor taxes that you pay in the form of sales taxes, etc. Nor does it look at corporate taxation or borrowing. This is just how your individual tax dollar is broken down. And one of the things that we do, we try and tell this story each year around tax time in different ways. And one of the things that we also do is, and again, if we have an opportunity later, I'll take you online and show you this. We have something called your tax receipt, where you can put in the amount of money you paid in taxes that year, and using these similar ratios, it breaks out for you how much of your tax payment went into the various subcategories that we have shown here. So it's a really good way to personalize how your tax dollars are being spent. There are a number of what we call barriers to entering into the discussion about cutting military spending, what we like to refer to as the elephants in the room. And the first one that almost inevitably comes up is the question about jobs, that cutting military spending is going to have a negative impact on jobs. And that is in fact true, because virtually all forms of federal investment generate jobs. But what this table shows us, and this is a chart based on work done by a group of economists here at UMass, the Perry Group, who tried to answer the question, what do we get for every $1 billion of federal investment into the economy? And what you see is that while the military investment into the military-industrial complex generates roughly 11,000 jobs, that compared to other areas of potential federal investment, it's a very poor performer. And that that if job creation is really your intent, you probably want to look at areas other than the military in order to promote the greatest level of economic improvement. It's also interesting to flip that on its ear, because if job preservation is your #1 priority and you're looking at ways to cut the federal budget, intuitively one would go to the military as the first place to cut in order to preserve the maximum number of jobs supported by federal investment. Another thing that you're going to hear, if you haven't already, is that the Pentagon has already been cut. While it's interesting rhetoric, factually it's not accurate. If you look, for instance, right now at the yellow line at the bottom, this is what the president proposed last February for the military. What you see is a minor reduction in spending between FY 2012 and 2013, about the order of 1.7%. And that would have been the first, if it was enacted, that would have been the first decline in the Pentagon's not war-related budget in over a decade. But what you see after that is, following that yellow line out, is a slow but continuing upward trend in spending out over the next 5 years. And President Obama, when he released the budget last year, said categorically that while it would go up at a slower rate than earlier intended, it would continue to rise over the next decade. And that is how the military has been able to say that they have reduced Pentagon spending. They haven't reduced Pentagon spending in actuality. What they've done is reduce the amount of money that they expect to spend over the next 5 years. And so if you look at the blue line above, that was what they were planning to spend over the next 5 years when they made their projections a year ago. Their updated projections, the yellow line, which is the basis for the budget request now, it's the difference between those two lines that represent the quote-unquote cuts that the Pentagon has been able to achieve, roughly $487 billion in spending that they projected would occur and now will not. So while they say they've cut the Pentagon, what they've actually really done is revise downwards how much of an increase they're going to get over the next 5 years. The analogy I like to draw in this situation is, let's say you go into work on Monday and your boss says to you, "I'm going to increase your salary next year by $20,000." And then you go into work a couple of days later, and the boss comes to you and says, "We've had to revise our budget projections for the coming year. I'm only going to be able to increase your pay by $10,000." For me, that's a $10,000 pay cut, but the way the Pentagon calculates it, I'm sorry, for me that's a $10,000 pay raise, but the way the Pentagon views it, it's actually a $10,000 pay cut. So the savings that they've achieved is a savings in lower projections about how fast their budget would grow. Another issue that comes up repeatedly is the U.S. military budget related to total global military spending. And as this chart from the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute shows, and they're probably the best source of material for international spending, the United States represents almost 43% of total global military spending. But that's only part of the story. If you look, for instance, at our closest allies, the members of the NATO alliance, that's another 19%. And together, us and our NATO allies account for almost 2/3 of global military spending. That doesn't include our additional list of allies. That's just NATO. It doesn't include places like Israel, South Korea, Japan, Saudi Arabia. So the point to make here is that us and our closest friends really are the dominant military spenders. And when you compare that to the nations that the military considers to be places where we will most likely have to act militarily in the future, combined, that group represents just the smallest fraction of global military spending. So really, the U.S. and friends represent the lion's share of global military spending. And although it's not accounted here, our second closest rival is China, and we outspend them roughly by a factor of 5 to 1. This is a figure we like to point out because it represents funding over the decade that followed 9/11, and it points to two things. One is at $7.6 trillion, what we spent on security over the last decade represents roughly half of the total total national debt that we've accumulated over the entire lifetime of the country. So if you're concerned about the size of the debt, you can see that a good portion of it resides here. But the other thing to point out is that security spending is not just the Pentagon. The Pentagon's base budget at $5.6 trillion over a decade That represents a 43% increase over that period of time. It's slightly different than the figure we showed earlier because we measured it in 2 different decades. But again, significant increases in the Pentagon space budget, not including the almost $1.4 trillion that we've spent on war, the almost 472 billion that we've spent on Homeland Security, not including the Department of Defense. This is Homeland Security outside of the Department of Defense, which is almost quadrupled over the last decade, and then $230 billion on nuclear weapons. And again, this is also a budget that continues to grow. So national security in this country, more broadly construed than just the Pentagon, represents a sizable investment, and it's one that's been growing over the last decade. One of the things that we like to do, and we feel we need to do in order to add legitimacy to the discussion about how we can cut military spending without negatively impacting our national security, is to do research on how you might re-envision defense spending and Pentagon spending, and come up with ways to do it more intelligently and for less money. I was a member back in 2010 of a group called the Sustainable Defense Task Force. This was a group convened by Congressman Barney Frank, who tasked us with coming up with significant reductions in military spending that didn't erode our national security capabilities and would make a meaningful contribution to the discussion on deficit reduction. The Sustainable Defense Task Force came up with roughly $1 trillion in defense spending cuts over the decade, and that represents about a 16% annual decrease, not including war costs. And the task force is not alone in its work. There have been numerous other entities that have done this kind of work, all of which I have resource links for you. The Unified Security Budget is one in which I also participated. The Project on Defense Alternatives does great work around this work. I've worked with the Cato Institute on this type of thing, and even individual members of Congress, like Senator Tom Coburn, who came up with a report just this, who's a Republican from Oklahoma, who came up with a report just this fall called The Department of Everything, who looked at the Pentagon budget and said, these are things that don't belong in the Pentagon's budget, and we ought to take them out. So the work around making meaningful reductions in military spending bridges the political and intellectual divide, and you can find resources out there that approach it from a number of different ways. The roles and missions, wasteful weapon systems, and just a whole spectrum of resources that are available that will help you to build the case that the Pentagon budget can and should be cut, and in a significant way. I want to spend just a couple of moments talking about some important resources that we utilize when we talk about weapon systems. If you want to look at the cost per an individual weapon, like what is the cost of one F-22 fighter, you look at something called the Selected Acquisition Report, which is put out by the Department of Defense on an annual basis, and that allows you to generate what are called the per unit costs, which is how much it costs to develop and acquire all the aircraft in a program or all the submarines in a program, and that's how we talk about the cost of individual weapons. If you want to talk about the cost of a weapons program in a particular year, what that year's request is, you go to the Department of Defense's program acquisition cost by weapon system, and in this they will tell you, for instance, that they're going to request $9 billion for missile defense in fiscal 13, that they're going to request $3 billion for the Virginia-class submarine, et cetera, et cetera. And then finally, there's a really good book, really good resource that the Department of Defense puts out called National Defense Budget Estimates. It's referred to within the Pentagon as the Green Book because of the color of its cover. And what this looks at is defense spending over time, trends within defense spending by the military branches, the percentage of the economy that the military takes up. So it's historical, usually dating back to World War II. So this is a good way to look at long-term trends in defense budgets. And when we look at defense spending over time, this is the kind of resource that we would go to. Who follows this data? Well, obviously we do, and then there are a long list of organizations that chart these types of costs. Some of them are listed here, but others of which we work with and could easily put you in contact with, and are pretty easy to find on the web. But these is just a short list of some of the people who we work with around trending these numbers. An important resource that we generated along with Peace Action over the summer and have recently published is our Move the Money training curriculum. The Move the Money project, sponsored by the Colum Foundation, tasked us in Peace Action with putting together a series of materials and provide a series of training of trainers to enable organizations, some who have looked at the military before, but others who have not, who are interested in talking about federal spending priorities, and help them integrate the discussion about Pentagon spending into their work related to federal budgets or federal programs. Our goal was to provide materials that would enable organizations to add to their portfolio of facts and figures around budget priorities useful information about the impact of high levels of military spending on other areas of the federal budget. And there are a long list of materials that were made available to that. The one that I want to point out specifically here, because it was it came up a couple of times in the inquiries that John received in advance of this presentation, is the impact of cutting the Pentagon budget on veterans benefits. And the short and simple answer is there is no connection. The Veterans Administration is funded through separate series of appropriations. The Department of Defense and veterans programs are not related. So while people think of veterans and the Pentagon in the same sentence, from a funding perspective, there is no linkage. So I think it's just important to point that out. And we have a great fact sheet that explains how that would work. So here are some of the organizations that we work with, and this is not an exhaustive list by any stretch of the imagination. In Coalition, we provide materials and briefings for a number of major national coalitions, some who work, like the New Priorities Network, primarily on this issue of moving the money from the military into other things, and others like the Coalition on Human Needs that focus on preserving funding for domestic programs, and then groups like the Women Without War Coalition, whose goal is primarily just the reduction of military spending and demilitarization of U.S. policy. And then there's a long list of organizations that we work with in various capacities. The top few: Fellowship, Peace Action, American Friends, and Friends Committee on National Legislation, I would characterize as sort of the traditional members of the peace movement. Then we work with groups, national groups like Women's Action for New Directions, which I would say is, again, primarily tied to the peace movement, but because of their sister organization, the Women's Legislative Lobby, which is an organization, a national organization of state and local elected officials, they begin to get into the government policy thing. And then national networks that work on other policy initiatives that include the military, like U.S. Action. Hardcore analytical groups like the Project on Defense Alternatives and the Cato Institute, they represent a broad cross spectrum of political ideology, who all for various reasons come to the table believing that reductions in military spending are both possible and important. And then what I consider to be sort of the good government groups, Taxpayers for Common Sense and Project on Government Oversight, that are all about responsible government, and that includes looking at the military, but not just the military, just looking at good government across the board. So that concludes my formal presentation. This is my contact information, and again, you'll be able to get to us in a number of different ways. John, how are we doing for time?
We can move into the Q&A, or if you wanted to move people through the website, there's a number of people who've asked questions.
Why don't we spend about 2 minutes doing that, if that's okay?
Okay, yeah, go for it.
All right. Okay, so.
Well, while Chris is setting that up, just to let people know, If you want to ask a question, we'll move into questions and answers in just a moment. Your control panel is somewhere on your GoToMeeting screen, and there you'll see a blue bar that says questions. And if you type in your question there, we'll pass it on to Chris um, just after he shows us kind of a little test drive on the National Priorities
Okay.
Project website.
Are you able to see that, or am I still one?
Yes.
Okay. So the first thing I'm going to show you is the new timeline, and as you can see, what this tells us, we have a series of entries by day. For instance, earlier this week, the Senate passed Hurricane Sandy Fund bill. If you were interested in finding out more of that, you click on Learn More, and it'll take you to NPP documents that discuss that. Moving forward, you can see sequestration, and it's supposed to go into effect on March 1, et cetera, et cetera. Some of the most important information related to military spending is on our cost of war website. This is where you can find our cost of war counters. It's still interesting to note that if you Google the phrase cost of war, this is the #1 site on the list. And it's here that you would find our new materials on the Move the Money training curriculum that I talked about. All that is embedded here. It's in downloadable form. And as I said, work that we did over the summer with Peace Action and some other groups with the support of the Colum Foundation. Some of the other things, we have a large take action component which talks to you about how you can get actively involved in the legislative process and also do media and that type of stuff. We have a very large interactive database. This is where I talked earlier about our tax receipt. If I were to type in, let's say I paid $2,500 in taxes last year, and do the chart. This is the chart that you saw earlier, but if you're interested in seeing specifically how it all paid out, we also did this year a tax receipt. So this is what you got for your taxes, and it shows, of my taxes, $675 went to the military, et cetera, et cetera. Down here, education, $62. So it's a good way of visualizing how your tax dollars are actually being spent. Another thing we do interactively is we have a very large database that provides a whole bunch of what we call indicators, which are based on, for instance, let's take a look at food. What we can find out, for instance, is how much benefits per food stamps by household, by individual. And then we can actually look, if we were to go over to expenditures, we can find out how much, for instance, the food stamp program funds in, and this data is available, as we see here, state by state and within states. So, for instance, in the state of New Hampshire, the food stamp program provides about $115 annually to individuals there. And if we wanted to, you could go and see this data down to the county level. So we have a large range of data of federal expenditures and what we call indicators, which are basically eligibility and that type of thing, which we hope are going to be useful to researchers in generating what we call data stories of how federal assistance works in your communities. And we're in the process of doing a major upgrade to these databases. We'll be able to provide even greater localization of data, hopefully in the coming months. So I think that's all we'll spend time on now. I encourage you to spend time wandering through our website. There's an awful lot of great material about the federal budget and particularly about the military, which I hope will be useful to you in building the tools that will help you with your work. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to John, and we can get into some questions.
Okay, thank you. And I want to add that the email that we will send to all participants afterwards will include links to the National Priorities Project website, as well as to the other websites that Chris has mentioned, many of which, for example, the New Priorities Network, include a lot of other resources as well. So there's about 8 or so questions already, Chris. And
Great.
there's a couple of them that I would group right away. Um, One is from Michael saying that the focus is usually on the size of the national security budget, and that's important, but we need to go further and open a conversation about military conversion if we hope to break the grip of the military industrial complex, and asks how we can have generate more of that conversation. Marianne asked a similar question, saying that related to the jobs issue. Yesterday, we saw negative economic growth, and that was attributed to cuts already in the Pentagon. So job losses in the military are not necessarily transferred to jobs available elsewhere. Um, there may be greater job growth per spending in other sectors, but job losses now through Pentagon cuts don't necessarily transfer to jobs available for those same folks elsewhere. And suggests that we
Yeah.
might be open to criticism for being dishonest if we don't acknowledge that there are actual job losses, and how we can talk about training people for other jobs and convert facilities to other sectors. So what's your comment on that, particularly about resources
Yeah.
for addressing that point?
Yeah, I think that that's absolutely true. And it has always been I've always described it as the Achilles heel of the efforts to reduce military spending, because you close a factory, no matter what it does, the question of concern to the people who work there is, where am I going to go tomorrow? And a job in the hand is worth the job that may or may not be there when you get out of there. It's a difficult question to answer, and I would say that the way to answer it isn't by specifically focusing on the role of the military in creating jobs, but on the role of the government in creating jobs, and that.
Chris, we lost you. Chris, we lost you.
Et cetera, et cetera, there was virtually no discussion of a job, any sort of grand deal around the deficit and sequestration and taxes. The administration did at one point make a very modest proposal, I think of about $50 billion, but that's not the way this is going to work. And to me, the easiest way to answer the question of what are we going to do about the military jobs that are lost if we cut the Pentagon budget is to improve the employment situation in this country overall, and that all boats will float, and that we'll all be better off if we put everybody back to work, not just people who lose their jobs because the military budget got smaller. So I think we have to approach this holistically, and I think we are subject to criticism on this topic, but that there are ways around it, and it goes to what the role of the government will be in job creation overall. And when you look at this chart, it's pretty easy to see that federal investment in other areas is going to help to offset those job losses and improve our economic performance overall. I mean, to my mind, I think we have to acknowledge the fact that we're going to spend more on healthcare, whether we like it or not, and that there are areas of federal investment like clean energy that not just create jobs, but do other that carry along with them other sort of component benefits. That and it's a discussion about sort of this national prioritization discussion where we have an opportunity to address some of these issues.
Yeah. Okay, we have quite a few more questions. And one of them is from Patrick, that you said something that activists have the best opportunity for impact during the congressional part of the budgeting process. Do you see an opportunity for a growing national movement leading to a shift in spending priorities, which of course is ultimately a form of war prevention?
I don't. Well, all right, let me say this. I've been around the military spending discussion for almost 2 decades now, and I would say that right now we have a better opportunity to enter into that discussion than we have for a number of years. And the reason is simple: we're in a situation where deficit reduction, rightly or wrongly, has become the currency of debate in Washington. And while that remains true, um, I honestly believe that all issues are on the table, and that includes the military. Now, whether that will translate into a long-term movement over time, I'm hopeful, but I don't know. I honestly can't project, but I do recognize this as being a window of opportunity that we haven't seen, particularly in the last decade since 9/11, to actually have a discussion about priorities with reducing military spending being a component of that discussion. We haven't had that opportunity, uh, for a number of years, and I think we need to build upon it to the best of our ability, both in achieving short-term reductions, but also making changes in the way we think about national security that will lead to a shifting of our overall federal prioritization away from the military and into other components of national strength, like education and a healthy population.
Right, right. So there's several different very specific questions, and maybe I'll group them together. One is Lorraine read that Congress is shifting funding from food stamps to the defense budget, and does your website reflect those changes? There's, should I ask them all together, or you want to?
Oh yeah, no, keep going. Well, and we'll see if
Okay.
there's a holistic answer to it.
Okay, so there's also a question from Steve about if there is data about the number of jobs lost if nuclear weapons were decreased, and that's that's specific to nuclear weapons. And then there was another question earlier um, about from Peter about if there was a way to look up expenditures by their intended mission, so that you could begin to kind of segregate out, okay, this particular mission can be cut and how much would that cost? So why
Yeah,
don't we
that's
put
that's
those
a
questions to you?
yeah. Um, well, as far as the last one, if you were to if you cut them, I guess if we were talking about military mission, we do believe that, and one of the things we want to do is stop looking specifically at individual programs like, say, Title I education, and look at educational subsidies as an aggregate, so that when you talk about housing, you're not just talking about Section 8 or something like that, but you're talking about federal investment in housing, and that's something that we hope to do. We can't do it now, but it's one of the visions we have for our database. The question about job loss related to cuts in nuclear weapons, I'm not aware of a source on that. The Perry study did not look at nuclear weapons; they looked at the military entirely. And what was the third one? I'm missing one.
Oh, on the I'm sorry,
Yeah, I should. Yeah, I got notes. I got notes on the last two. I didn't get the first one. Maybe we'll circle back to it. What else you got?
um, okay, the a couple technical ones also. We've heard that the Defense Department's budget has been doubled since 2001, but your graph says 43%.
Yeah,
Um,
one of the problems that you run into is what are you counting? For instance, if you don't adjust it for inflation, you see a doubling. Even in this presentation here, in one section I looked at 2001 through 2011, and in another I looked at 2002 through 2012, and those figures are slightly off. Great minds are going to differ on this. You get into an apples and oranges. I'm more than happy to look at other numbers and explain what the differences between ours and theirs are. But we use the numbers that we use. And if you have a specific set of numbers that you'd like to have me walk through and try and interpret how they're different, I'm more than happy to do that.
yeah, it could be that that's from when the ongoing war spending was at its peak.
Yeah,
Uh,
I mean, if you look at, for instance, if you look at '08 and '09, where war spending was about 180 billion as opposed to the 100 billion that it is now, that's going to make a change. But I'm more than happy to try and investigate those differences and explain them to them if you can give me a source for where the number came from.
Right. So there's a couple questions about how things are broken out. So Curtis says your graph on where the tax dollar goes showed medicine and health almost as large as military spending, but that didn't include Medicare tax. And so asks about those medicine and health expenses. And then there's a question about whether the tax receipts represent the discretionary or the total federal budget. So if you
Yeah,
could address
two good
those.
questions. One of the problems that we have in doing, I mean, there are literally thousands of federal programs that receive in your individual tax dollars, and we needed to group them into a way that made some sort of sense. For instance, when you look at Medicare and health, Medicare is not funded by your individual income tax dollar primarily. Most of it is paid for through your payroll tax deduction, your FICA contribution. But there are some very small amounts of Medicare money included in the discretionary budget, and they are mainly for administrative expenses within the Medicare program. They're not related to benefits. So there's some there are some issues that we have with how we break out these things, and we actually review how we break out our tax day data on an annual basis in order to make sure it's telling the story that we think is out there to the best of our ability. But it's imperfect. The second part with regard to the receipt. Programs like the military and like education are not funded exclusively by individual tax contributions. And what this chart here does, and what our tax receipt does, is look at those portions of those programs only that are funded by your tax receipt. Where else would funding for these programs come from? Well, corporations do pay some taxes. Some would argue not very much, but arguably they do. And the other part of it is, a third of what we're going to spend this year is going to be money that's borrowed. What these attempt to do is create a relationship between your tax dollar and these programs, but it does not imply that all of the discretionary money is accounted for in these tables, because that is not true.
Right. Okay. So the question we missed before was about shifting
Food
funding
stamps.
from food stamps. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
We actually have state-level tables on our federal budget website that look at the last couple of years of food stamps programs, and they are, in some states they're going up, in some states they're going down, and there are reasons for that. Overall, the trend is downwards, but I want to offer just a word of caution, because it's very difficult to say that money that came out of that program went specifically into the military. It went somewhere else, and military spending is going up. But to say that with absolute certainty that this dollar went from point A to point B is probably something that you couldn't really track on paper. We know intuitively if one area of spending, like for instance, Chairman Paul Ryan, who's the House Budget Committee chairman, when he marked up his FY13, virtually every area along the lines of what we see on this table, virtually every area of spending that he looked at went down, and the only one that went up was the military.
Uh-huh.
And in that situation, it's pretty clear to me that all your cuts are going, they went to two places. They went to the military and they went to deficit reduction. Mm-hmm. And that's a pretty easy argument to make. But it's hard to draw the dotted line between the Pentagon and the Department of Education, or the Pentagon and the food stamp program.
Uh-huh. Great. Well, Edith asks whether there's a way to trace the military spending to particular congressional districts, or to a location, especially where members of Congress who are getting funds from the defense industry, particularly perhaps in campaign contributions, and then vote to fund the military. So is there a way to break that down?
Yeah, that's a great question. The Department of Defense used to provide pretty good information down to the state level. They stopped teasing it out individually, and it now lives within a much larger government database where it's a lot harder to identify. This is something that I actually am working with my colleagues who run our database as we do upgrades, to try and figure out if we can find good data coming out of the government that'll allow us to do this, because it's a really important question. So the short answer is currently not really, but with the hope that sometime in the future we'll be able to manage the data in a way that we'll be able to tell that story a little better, because I think it's critical. And it would be also critical to do it not just within the Department of Defense, but also within healthcare and a whole other range of industries that contribute vast sums of money to the campaigns of our elected officials. I think it's great information to have. It's not easily accessible, if at all accessible.
Right.
But we're looking.
So there's also a question that came in early on. There's some questions about whether China's reports accurately on its budget. So in that slide that you presented about the U.S.'s role in the world's military budget, do you have any comment on that?
Yeah. That's a really interesting question, because it has to do with the fact that less so now, but for a long time the Chinese economy was centrally controlled, so the value of its currency vis-a-vis the United States wasn't easy to calculate, and I think to this day that's still true. Likewise, they don't have to pay their people what we have to pay our people. They still use, to a certain degree, a large level of conscription, so their personnel costs are a lot lower. So what that 5-to-1 ratio I talked to about is, and this is getting a little bit down into the weeds, but SIPRI, the people who generate those numbers, when they feel that they can't make that comparison honestly using a dollar for dollar calculation, they do something called purchasing power parity, which is basically a reflection of what level of burden does the Chinese military place on its economy vis-a-vis the level of burden that our military places on our economy, and they come up with a ratio and they translate it into a dollar figure. That's one of the vagaries. The other is, for a long time, right now they're not supposed to. They supposedly got out of this business a decade ago, but for a long time, the Chinese was a for-profit. The People's Liberation Army was a for-profit. They operated, for instance, factories that produced weapons that they then sold on the open market. They're not supposed to be doing, and they actually operated non-defense businesses as well, like agricultural concessions and things like that. They're not supposed to be doing that anymore, but I think there's still a legacy of that, which would also help to sort of make that a difficult number to know, scientifically. So what do we know about the Chinese? They are investing, by their own admission, an increasing percentage of their GDP in the military. They are acquiring more increasingly sophisticated technologies, and they're probably 3 to 4 decades behind us in most areas. They are not interested in being a global superpower, but they are interested in being able to defend their particularly their regional interests as a growing global economy. That they view it the same way we do. It's about access to natural resources, and they are pursuing improved technology and capability. There's no doubt about it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So just a couple more questions. One is, what is the role of the State Department in this military funding? How do they? Are they they represented in the international affairs portion, or how does that parse
Yeah, that's
out?
a great question. They do appear in what are referred to as the Function 150 accounts. That's the international affairs budget. But it gets to an even bigger question, which is, what is it that the State Department is being asked to do, and how are they funded? And there's one of the resources that I mentioned earlier, which I would highly recommend on this subject, is something called the Unified Security Budget. This is something that I've worked on annually for about the last 7 or 8 years. It's put out by the Institute for Policy Studies. Miriam Pemberton is the person who sort of marshals it. She works with Lawrence Korb at the Center for American Progress. And what they posit is that national security would benefit from a reallocation of funding away from defense and into preventive diplomacy. And they look at the ratios of defense spending, which they refer to as offensive spending, versus State Department, which they call preventive spending, over time. And they build the case, I think, quite eloquently that we become more secure when we spend more money on being good friends and good neighbors than on being good policemen. So again, it's the unified security budget. The resources are on within embedded within this presentation, and I highly recommend you take a look at it. It makes really interesting reading.
Great. There's there's a couple questions that might be about your reflecting on the workshops that you've given and the kinds of conversations that you've had, and that has to do with the role of emotion. So, because sometimes it seems that um, it's not really the conversation is not really based on facts, but it's more based on fear or mythologies about militarism and security and the ways that the military is practically worshipped. So I think there are two different people, both Stephanie and Richard, who asked questions about how we can address people's emotions and not just address this on an intellectual level. So I'm wondering what your reflections are on that, since you've been talking with people about this in a lot of different
Yeah, and
areas.
I'll say in advance, I'm a budget person, but you're right. This is a discussion that we have, and this is a hot button issue for a lot of people, particularly I mean. Once upon a time, I worked for a group called the Center for Defense Information, and they were some of the first former active duty military people who were actively engaged in conversations this, with their counterparts in the Soviet Union, and they were accused of being, communist sympathizers and that type of thing. When what they were really trying to do was work with people on the other side of the wall who recognized that the number of nuclear weapons we had was crazy. So it's always going to be a volatile debate, and I think that the strategy we have to recognize is that, and one of the things that's material that's in the Move the Money portion of our materials is something put out by Rethink Media, which is a media outfit that works on national security issues, and it's point by point how to talk about the military. It's really, really useful. And the point they want to try and make is that the military and and national security are not synonymous. And secondly, this isn't about the troops. And we get into this question about, cutting defense and veterans. That's why I went out of my way to point out that there's not a linkage between the two. And that you can develop strategies where you find common interests that bring people together about what the future of this nation ought to be. And then within that context, you can have a more sort of reasoned discussion about what the role of the military, what the role of the Pentagon is going to be within this sort of broader discussion about what the future of our national priorities are going to be. But it's a nuanced discussion, and it's not one that lends itself to short, snappy sound bites like no new taxes or something like that. It requires some finesse and some creativity of thought, and I recommend the Rethink Media. I won't go into their stuff point by point, but I recommend the Rethink Media fact sheet that's in our Move the Money materials as a good jumping off place for how to start formulating these discussions. And they also did a lot of polling about what words work and what words don't work and that type of stuff. So it's a pretty useful tool.
Yeah. Well, also, I would add that in my experience, art is often, whether it's theater or visual art or film, is often a much people reaches people who aren't necessarily tuned into the intellectual questions around the budget. Um, so there's before we wrap up, there were a couple questions just about National Priorities Project and about you, so that we can show that we're have solid ground for the arguments that we're making. So one of the questions is about just what your qualifications are, which I think maybe is much a question about your sources of information. And the other is just about how NPP supports itself. So could you
Okay.
address those?
Well, as far as our source material goes, probably Other than where I identified it differently, separately, or other organizations with whom we work and that type of thing, the lion's share of the budget crunching numbers that we do come directly either from the Department of Defense or the Office of Management and Budget. And it's all in the public domain. Our value added is we know how to look at it. We're experienced in parsing it out and breaking it out into useful bites. But the spreadsheets are there for everybody to look at. So it's not a question of not being able to find it. I can direct you to it on the website. I rely on my colleagues and my personal experience in looking at budgets to be able to tease out the things that are useful and show them in, we hope, a constructive manner. I don't want to go into any more personal detail unless people want to, but I worked on Capitol Hill as a staffer for 10 years doing defense and foreign policy stuff, and also as a member of the Appropriations Committee staff for some time looking at just how the appropriations process works. And National Priorities Project, we are funded through a mix of foundation grants and contributions, sometimes very generous contributions from individual donors. And you can find at the NPP website our annual reports. All that data is available, and it's in the public domain. We're a 501c3. We're a tax-exempt organization, so all that info is available on site.
Great. One thing I want to mention, and there is one more pair of questions that I'm going to ask, but is that for people who want to act, and there was a question, for example, about how to, what should we be asking Congress at the, in advance of sequestration. And one thing we want to suggest to people is that you become part of the Jobs Not Wars campaign, which has collected about 50,000 signatures from people. It's directed to Congress and the president, and an urging to redirect military spending to human needs and social programs. So in part, it deals with some of that jobs question that came up earlier. And you can find that at jobs-not-wars.org. And in addition to signing on there and circulating that petition, there's other ways of getting involved, as well as other materials that supplement a lot of the materials that Chris has been talking about.
And we work with Jobs Not War, and I can add them to our coalition list in this document if you want to, or you can do it, John, however you prefer.
Great. jobsnotwars.org. And then one final question is, or again, a kind of related pair of questions, which has to do with how much of the spending is direct spending versus how much is for contractors and purchases. That's a question from Edith.
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that, and I'm not sure that it's a knowable answer. I can tell you anecdotally that contractors do play a major role both in the Pentagon and within the field. The statistics on in the field are actually kind of shocking. Back in the 1991 Gulf War, the ratio of uniformed personnel to contractors was about 10 to 1. In Afghanistan, I don't know what it is currently, but the last report I saw from their IG back about 6 months ago put it at less than 1 to 1. That means there were more contractors than there were uniformed U.S. military personnel. So it's a staggering amount. The reason we don't know it is that it comes through accounts where they are not listed as it's not listed as payments to contractors, and so it's not a number that I know that anybody can trace. But anecdotally, we know that it's very important. We are seeing right now, and this is related to sequestration, a freeze on the hiring of contract personnel within the Department of Defense. These are contract people who provide mainly administrative services, but not exclusively through the Department of Defense. And it may very well be that as a result of that freeze, we will see some numbers generated as to the amount of savings that creates that will help us have some insight into this, because it'd be a really interesting piece of information to have. But right now, I think it falls in the category of as an unknowable number, but it's an important number.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Chris, and thank you to everyone who participated. Again, we will be posting this webinar as well as the slide presentation at our website. We'll send out a link to that to everyone who registered, and urge you to pass on the word and act in order to shift the money from the military to human needs. So again, thanks, and we'll see you on the next time around.